Better make it quick, because they're probably going to come up here.
This is also in honor of Gabriella Miller, age 10. Just died a few weeks ago in October. She had brain cancer. 10-year-olds are not supposed to get brain cancer. My sister and I both had severely disabled children. We lived in the Hoffman Estates near the Chicago Piles in 63 to 65. Bloody noses every day from 3 to 5 years of age. We had handicapped children. People are dying. Kevin Blanch calls it the Pacific genocide, and that's what's happening. But it's not just the Pacific that's dying. Radiation is killing this world. Your children and your genomes are over. We can stop this.
Fukushima is the most terrifying situation I can imagine. You ask, what can we do? First of all, you have got to get a government that is in total collusion with TEPCO, the energy company. They're lying through their teeth.
Sailors say explosions like this made them sick when radioactive plumes settled on board the USS Ronald Reagan off the coast of Japan, and their attorney, Paul Garner, wants the country to pay up.
They have physical problems. One of them is bleeding from his rectum already. The others have problems with thyroid glands.
And Garner says another sailor now has cancer and recently had a baby with birth defects. These are all traits associated with radiation poisoning.
We're just joking around because at the time there's still rumors going around about radiation being on the ship. And we're joking around about my growing extra fingers and toes and stuff like that. And we were like, let's stop and get checked for radiation, because they started setting up these little checkpoints all along the ship. And they're saying it's just a precaution, you don't have nothing to worry about.
I mean, this thing has been pushed into the Pacific from day one for 958 days. And it doesn't matter if it's in the Pacific or it's in the air. It doesn't matter. You know, the marine layer rolls into California.
The mysterious die-off of West Coast sea stars is spreading.
The so-called melting sea stars were first noticed in Vancouver, then in Seattle, and now in California.
Took them out as a precaution. There is a huge unknown as to why there is currently a die-off happening out in the wild.
Few people would want to touch one of these. Sunflower sea stars infected with a strange melting disease, literally coming apart in the hands of biologists. The Seattle Aquarium sunflower sea stars are being held in isolated tanks away from the public. They're in quarantine.
God bless you, Gabriella. It's been 1 month since her death. She was 10 years old. She died of a sudden onset of brain cancer for no apparent reason. 11 months after Fukushima. She is just one of millions of children. Yes. Cancer, I've heard recently, is the #1 reason for childhood death in America.
That if, in fact, the fourth plant goes under an earthquake and those rods are exposed, it's bye-bye Japan, and everybody on the west coast of North America should evacuate. Now, if that isn't terrifying, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I was at work one day and doing a safety observation on somebody, and all of a sudden I get this hot metallic taste in my mouth. It felt like the back of my head was going to blow off. And it was like, what was that? And I had a foreman standing next to me, and I told him, I said, hey, I think something just happened. I don't know what it was. But then after starting to understand what this whole thing is with the hot particles, I'm pretty sure that's what I sucked in, because the very next day it was like my whole immune system had shut down, and I came down with this horrible cold and just felt like garbage.
Me, myself, I've had multiple miscarriages. I was completely infertile. I've watched the death of my babies year after year after year. My mother-in-law has cancer. My friend Jane Milliker has cancer. The list goes on and on.
They put out the word, everything's fine, we got everything under control, and they lull everybody, the world, into a false sense of security.
And I get my boots checked, my pants, and then my hands. And as soon as they get to my hands, the machine just goes crazy. And instantly, like, we went from like smiling to just being nervous and scared. And they instantly told everybody to back away from me. They made a perimeter around me.
You have seawater that they're using to cool it, because that adds to the creation of isotopes.
Totally different isotopes that wouldn't have been released otherwise.
I wish we knew what the real damage to the ocean was at this point. I think it would be so scary. I think about it every day.
At least 3 of the aquarium's captive sea stars were melting. Their tanks are filled with Puget Sound water, and the scene out there is worse. Aquarium divers found a much more serious situation in the wild population along the Seattle waterfront. The victims they brought up were in various stages of the disease. The estimates of infected sea stars has grown from 30% to 50 or 60% in just a few days. And now biologists in California are finding it too.
Something is causing sea stars to be diseased along the coast at different locations.
West Coast aquariums have sent samples to several labs and are still awaiting results. An important species to the overall ocean health and one of their star attractions is at risk. In Seattle, Gary Chittum, King 5 News.
Seattle aquarium scientists say if they can identify the problem, they may be able to treat sea stars in there's exhibits, but there's not much they can do for the sea stars in the wild.
And I have a number of foreign exchange student friends. I hang out with mostly Japanese people. There's at least 3 of them here that are from Fukushima Prefecture and one from Sendai, which is about 50 miles north. And they say the babies being born there it's so many birth defects. All the kids are low energy. They have fatigue. They don't have any desire to do anything. They just feel like zombies.
Because it's very hard to imagine how there could be a 5-fold increase in natural background radiation from the sort of material that's coming from Fukushima. Having said that, and having also done the calculations about the concentrations that would likely to be in the ocean, what I have noticed, and this is actually terrifying, is that since Fukushima there has been an increasing collapse in the entire Pacific ecosystem. And this is not something which one can just kind of poo-poo or write off.
That's what I was going to raise. We have mainline oceanic university studies as high as 98% death, starfish, fish. They've never before seen whales that are Siamese twins or conjoined.
At this point, my mother had 6 miscarriages. Teenagers are dying of heart attacks all across the states. In California, I know 5 or 6 people who had stillborn babies in the last 2 years. These are people who the doctor said the babies died because of stress. These are mothers who were in their early 20s. We see the animals dying. We see things coming out of the ocean. People are feeling it. Everybody's tired. Sore throats, people's hair falling out. There are things that we could be doing. Our thyroids are being completely blown away. We've got nodules. My best friend in California, Gary, 27 years old, has got a thyroid nodule that just cropped up in the last year. Why? I'll tell you why. Fukushima!
The next miracle is nuclear energy. The thing I'm investing in, and not because I expect to make a ton of money on it, it's because I think because it's zero CO2, because the economics are so good, is a 4th generation design. And there are many 4th generation designs. This one is very, very attractive. By 2022, if everything goes perfectly, our demo reactor will be in place. And by 2028, again, assuming everything continues to go perfectly, it will be a design that could be replicated and built in many, many, many places. You could build, at that point, because you have no fuel constraint, and according to me, you have extremely good economics, good safety, no proliferation, no waste. Then you could go nuts.
If everything goes perfectly.
Absolutely.
How often does everything go perfectly?
In nuclear, well, if you ignore. No, come on. If you ignore 1979 and 1986 and 2011, come on, we've had a good century. So the idea of full passive safety. Gen 3 takes us to much, much, much better passive safety, not full passive safety. Gen 4, whoever's Gen 4 gets built, will be a no human required, no zirconium turning into hydrogen to explode type design.
Great change is afoot in our world, albeit a change as terrifying as it is invisible. Many have succumbed and died already in this invisible war. Many more will continue to die unless we change direction. What we do from here will determine whether the death toll claims enough lives to end life on Earth, or permit enough life to survive to avoid extinction. As it is, the survivors will already have to share a planet alongside a host of newly released and pervasive radiological terrors. It is 4 years since the Olympics were scheduled to be held in Tokyo, which in the end never took place. For the world is an inhospitable place now, its life-giving biosphere destroyed by irrevocable man-made climate change. Not due to carbon dioxide, and not due to heat waves and firestorms, but sub-zero freezing temperatures and almost complete darkness, with an atmosphere filled with carbon-14. Nuclear winter and radionuclide contamination born of both catastrophic and colossal nuclear accidents and thermonuclear conflict have affected a dystopic climate change often alluded to in science fiction imaginings. How did humanity arrive and end here? It was in sunlit waters like these that life on Earth began. In time it would migrate to the land. These organisms know nothing of human activity above them that their forebears helped to spawn, but soon they probably will, to their detriment. In a kind of cruel and ungrateful payback to the debt we owe these waters and the oceans for our human existence, in a betrayal of our human origins and biological ancestry, life on Earth may so very easily be ended from dimly lit, man-made pools of water like this one, a stone's throw away from the ocean where it began. The town of Pripyat sits 3 kilometers from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Reactor 4 melts down on April 26, 1986, releasing significant radiation across Eastern and Northern Europe. After some considerable initial denial, the Soviet authorities mobilize. Local residents are evacuated. 500,000 reservists, miners, and specialists descend upon Chernobyl. They clean up and dispose of radioactive debris, liquidating the area, even shooting down irradiated animals. Most importantly, they excavate beneath the melting reactor core so as to extract deposited water from its basement and then fill it with concrete. This water extraction avoids a high-pressure second explosion that would have rendered much of Europe uninhabitable. The basement concrete will be the foundation of the sarcophagus. For several months, this special task force fights day after day with meager, improvised protective clothing and equipment, so that the reactor core that has morphed into an unyielding corium lava does not reach the aquifer below, contaminating the Pripyat River, then the Dnieper, and on to the Black Sea. Despite this victory, a Russian research paper will be finally published in the New York Academy of Sciences in 2010, citing the combined Chernobyl death toll to be 1 million persons worldwide. A tragic yet unsurprising figure, as the fallout from Chernobyl was 100 times greater than the fallout from the combined atomic detonations at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This does not account for the thousands of miscarriages and genetic diseases that have afflicted countless Eastern European children since. Many of the liquidators have died or are dying as a result of their efforts. This story was only told in detail in the documentary The Battle of Chernobyl 20 years later. few thousand kilometers from warm Hawaiian waters steams a US Navy Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. It projects American power and prestige in international waters and is a key player in the contemporary war on terrorism. Such a vessel and its battle group can lay waste to any good-sized nation-state in minutes. Now it has just received word that a terrible disaster has befallen its ally nation of Japan. The ship, along with its support vessels, steamed towards North Japan to render assistance. Yet, the USS Ronald Reagan will fail disastrously in its mission to mitigate the suffering of the people of Japan, and also in its primary mission of defending the United States homeland against terrorist enemies. It never even stood a chance. For all its military might, its 100,000-ton displacement, bristling high-tech weapons and highly trained personnel, the Reagan and its task force was unknowingly fighting a battle it did not comprehend, was ill-equipped for, and moreover was never mandated to seriously engage. It was pitted against an insurmountable enemy. It was up against the four exploded nuclear reactor buildings with a radioactive arsenal the equivalent of 14,000 Hiroshima bombs. Before 3/11 they were used for power generation for Japanese civilians, but now in an instant converted Godzilla-like into a massive and invulnerable nuclear artillery battery pummeling the whole Pacific Ocean. Its invisible, destructive venom is not carried by shells and gunpowder, but the airstream, water currents, and infected microbes and complex multicellular organisms. Many of its salvos explode continually for thousands of years, not making craters, but destroying DNA, over half-lives as long as 24,000 years. Against such an enemy, the task force turned tail and beat an ignominious retreat. At Fukushima Daiichi, the northern Japan earthquake and tsunami causes not only the explosion and meltdown, but the full China syndrome of 3 larger nuclear reactor cores at reactors 1, 2, and 3. A terrific explosion at reactor 4 severely destabilizes the building that in itself houses 10 Chernobyls worth of potential fallout in a storage pool stacked 100 feet in the air. The USS Ronald Reagan had no idea there was a nuclear accident at Fukushima when it embarked upon Operation Tomodachi. The Daiichi plant operator TEPCO, the Japanese government, and the US military, when faced with a nuclear disaster many more times grave and deadly than Chernobyl, instead of mobilizing its resources and manpower to engage this even more formidable enemy than was present at Chernobyl 25 years earlier, chose not to respond and let the radioactive chips fall where they may. Instead of mirroring the great Marshall Soviet effort at Chernobyl that saved Mother Russia, and in turn the whole of Europe, these fabled warriors against terrorism are stood down. They do not, and have not yet begun the Battle of Fukushima. Instead of battle, there is colossal betrayal. This betrayal at Fukushima will kill millions sooner or later. Even if the battle were to begin now, tremendous damage to our planet has been done, and millions are slated to suffer egregiously. We can only guess and estimate because governments are doing all they can to obscure what is happening in the waters and the air near Fukushima. Where one failed at Chernobyl in 1986, 3 have succeeded stunningly at Fukushima. 3 nuclear reactor cores have not merely penetrated through their reactor and concrete containment, but have reached the aquifer below that flows into the Pacific Ocean. These lava flows are similar to what the melted reactor cores look like, but in no way as toxic. Unlike conventional lava, corium lava remains hot for much, much longer, and more to the point are highly radioactive for thousands and thousands of years. This German Marine Research Lab model, released after the accident, shows a single oceanic radiation release that contaminates the whole of the Pacific Ocean that reaches North America in several years. In truth, however, endless waves of these releases, one after the other, would be more accurate. Having mixed with the now subterranean reactor cores, 400 tons of radioactive contaminated water has been flowing into the Pacific every day for the past 2.5 years, having only been recently confirmed by the New York Times.
Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Plim. We're about to pull into a routine port call in South Korea, and we found out that the tsunami and earthquake happened. Immediately we knew that we were going to reroute the ship to Japan to provide aid and give them food, water. So we did that immediately. We probably got to the coast of Japan by the day after it happened. We never heard anything about a nuclear power plant. We never knew about the possibility, let alone any kind of leak. So we were there outside. Our job as quartermasters is not only navigating the ship, driving, plotting our course and track, but going outside at the top of the ship to raise flags, to communicate with other ships. So being outside, we were breathing in this radiation. We were handling flags, which are porous, very porous material, obviously. We didn't really hear anything for probably a couple weeks after about a leak in the power plants. And even then, it was just still considered kind of a rumor. The ship didn't really even go on lockdown, which I mean by that, like no one was allowed outside. Probably until about a month and a half after the 11th, March 11th. So we were outside breathing this in, handling stuff, handling materials, and just absorbing the radiation. About halfway through, probably around the summertime, my menstrual cycle just disappeared completely. And then it would come back and disappear and go on and off. And this happened until about the summer of 2012, where it came back in such full force that I was in and out of the emergency room. Once they thought they were going to have to do a blood transfusion on me because I had lost so much. In addition to that, in February 2012, I developed bronchitis. And then from February to the summer of 2012, I got it 6 times. I was sent to a respiratory doctor, and it was determined that I developed asthma. So a lot of people don't understand that once you get out of the Navy, you don't get any health care at all. If you retire and you stay in 20 years, you get health care. This is also what we're involved in a lawsuit against TEPCO for medical expenses that we're going to have to pay out of pocket for.
We also fly our American flag, or ensign, at the highest point so people know we're the U.S. Navy. I was told by one of the higher-ups to go out and retrieve the American flag so we can give it to the Japanese as a friendship type of deal, like a gift. I pulled the flag down, it was flapping in the wind and wrapped around me, it got all over me. I folded it up, took it down there, I gave it to them, and I'm not sure what they did with it, but I got off watch an hour later. And we make it to the decon station, and I see there's a huge pile of clothes there from other sailors. And I go in, and they had to remove 3 layers of skin off my hands and my arms. They called and asked me to come up on watch to relieve the people on watch, and they told me that I had received the highest amount of radiation out of anybody on the ship. Like 2 months after, a lump appeared on my jaw, and I went and got that looked at by the Navy Medical, and they told me that there was nothing they could do about it while we're out to sea. We'd have to wait for us to pull in. And another lump appeared between my eyes. I have another lump on my right thigh. As soon as I got out of the military, I went back to college and I started playing college sports again. And slowly after that, my body just started to fall apart. It's harder for me to breathe now. It feels a lot like my lungs are too big for my body whenever I do something like strenuous. I lost a lot of weight from the time I was in the Navy until now. I got stomach ulcers. It doesn't look like it, but my hair's started to fall out. I try to avoid brushing and combing it. Like a little bit after we found out the ship was radiated and we had finished up helping out, we left the area. And before we pulled into our first port since the disaster, we all had to sign this paperwork saying that the military is not to be held liable for anything that happened, and we had to sign paperwork saying that we weren't sick, that we were okay, and that they did tests on us. And it wasn't like a yes or no type of option. It was just like you have to sign it.
Mutations are regularly reported in Japan and North America, moreover, as the Pacific jet stream and precipitation carries it eastward and ingloriously dumps it onto the New World. 1,300 fuel rods are sitting in a pool 100 feet above the ground in the weakened building, the Reactor 4 building. If a mishap during this fabled fuel removal, that some independent observers rightly doubt is taking place at all, causes an explosion, it would likely result in the abandonment of Daiichi, the free release of radioactive water on top of that existing, and the meltdown of all the spent fuel stored at the site, making the release scenario an 85 times Chernobyl event. In truth, what is happening at Reactor 4 is unclear and likely fraught with its own deception within the greater cover-up of the whole Fukushima radiation crisis. The possible scenarios are either that the fuel pool has already burned into the Pacific jet stream and ocean, or are at best largely still sitting in a pool of water, but the evidence leans closer to the former scenario. Equally stunning and far-reaching as this disaster is the astounding silence and myopia, not merely by governments and the pliant media, but also the overwhelming majority of academia, public figures, health advocates, and NGOs, even fabled environmental groups.
I thought for sure after day 100, day 200, somebody would break ranks at Berkeley or Stanford or Oregon State or Washington. We'd get a study come out of the Pacific Ocean showing plutonium in the plankton, and the whole world would go crazy, and that would be the end of nuclear. I really thought that's how it could play out. And here we are, 956 days later? Mm-hmm. Not one single study freaking out of any of these 300 marine biologists, parachutes, not one saying yay or nay. Now, who would ever believe that is possible? Yet people are still waiting for confirmation from BBC, Reuters, CNN, they're still waiting.
I thought Greenpeace would be all over this after 3/11. I mean, you look at their website and then you click on oceans, and there's nothing there about Fukushima at all. Pacific Ocean.
Well, get this, Andrew. When I was in San Diego this summer,
yeah,
I had it out with a young activist on Pacific Beach Pier, and I had him call, what's his name, the head of Greenpeace. He lives up in the trestle, and he came down, and I'm like, where are you guys? Where are you guys? And, you're using these grants. They're nothing but, they've evolved to the Sierra Club, Greenpeace. They are nothing but cash cows for these people at the top. They've went the same way with everything. You got to see the house that dude lives in. Same with the guy they had at Sierra Club. They've turned into fundraising organizations. Yeah. So he told me, here's exactly what he told me. He says, Kevin, we have a flyer that goes out to our website once a week, and we rank the top 10 issues that people want us to address. And Fukushima hasn't made the top 10 yet. And I says, so you're about fundraising. You're not about leading. You're not about telling them what the most important issue. You're letting them tell them, so you're all about fundraising.
Yeah,
and that's what they are.
They're diversifying so they can increase their funding.
$20.
I wouldn't even give them that much. of an excuse. I would say they're gatekeepers. The people that had these organizations up get corrupted and become gatekeepers. They hold the truth in and turn it and twist it to suit their own pocketbook.
Behind any of these groups too. I mean, if you notice, like the people who are being the loudest, who are putting out the most information, are the ones that aren't getting paid to do any of this. You know,
Exactly.
they're doing it out of, you know, using their own funds, you know, digging, you know, into their own pockets to try to fund themselves and stay away from that, because you know, you don't even want to go down that road. It always, you know, then you have people that want to tell you what to talk about and what to say. And so it is, any organization that receives any kind of funding, and that includes activists, are the last people that I get information from.
And how can anyone believe that this thing isn't the greatest ecological disaster in the history of humanity?
A mere handful of independent scientists and health experts have spoken out about the true nature of the disaster. Nuclear engineer Arnie Gundersen, physician Dr. Helen Caldecott, and chemical scientist and advisor to the EU on radiation Dr. Chris Busby have fought for the dangers of the ionizing radiation to be known to the general public. Dr. Lauren Murray has also notably pointed out the distinct possibility of the 3/11 earthquake being man-made. Such is the technology available to those who may have reason to use it. Also, tremendous to-the-minute reporting on the Fukushima disaster was done not by the media and luminous organizations like the UN or Greenpeace, but by a motley crew of individuals. Kevin Blanche, a long-time anti-nuclear activist and analyst, declared publicly that the 3 reactor cores were most likely in full meltdown several days after March 11, 2011. Christina Consolo runs the site FukushimaFacts.com, that is an online omnibus of radiation and disaster information that assists the public on how to mitigate the effects of radioactive fallout. Tony Muga is a musician turned author-journalist who broke the story of the Nuclear Regulatory Council's internal documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. These documents detail the ongoing data findings and private but alarmed conversations between officials at the NRC as the radioactive plume hit North America a few days after March 11. Iori Mochizuki is a Japanese self-described cyber dissident who writes on his site fukushimadiary.com that provides detailed scientific and anecdotal news reporting of the effects of the disaster. All these persons prior to 3/11 living relatively normal lives, now thrust and self-conscripted in a struggle to generate public recognition that the Battle of Fukushima must be started. Slowly their reports are prying open the eyes of the world public about Fukushima, yet many times faster and widespread than the TV-addled public are the radionuclides that are literally running circles around them and the globe and the relatively tiny Fukushima Truth Movement. But not only is the eastbound radiation relentless and indefatigable, but so are the financial resources, master strategies, and lobbying power of the nuclear lobby. With Germany renouncing and France withdrawing from nuclear power, the response of the nuclear lobby has been to double and triple down vigorously. Demonstrative of its power is its ability through government proxies to switch off radiation detectors across the United States and raise the acceptable radiation doses in Japan and America. It has coerced the Japanese government to burn radioactive waste across Japan and create laws against whistleblowing. Now it seeks nuclear plants elsewhere as the psychological fallout from Fukushima seemingly died down a few months after 3/11. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and the Turkish government in October 2013 signed an agreement with a consortium led by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to build 4 nuclear reactors in the Black Sea city of Sinop at an estimated cost of more than $22 billion. Abe seeks new contracts with Vietnam, Russia, and India. A new nuclear plant in Hinkley Point in Britain that will go online in 2023 has also been given the go-ahead.
I'm Robert Stone. I'm the producer and director of the film. Most documentaries function and are marketed and have a life out in the world by reinforcing people's preconceptions about the world. What we've done here with this movie is to take a different tack. It's not like coming at you in your face and saying, oh, you're wrong, this is why you're wrong. It's we are you, and we were wrong about some things, and we were wrong for a whole variety of reasons because we were given information that was wrong.
This documentary, financed by Microsoft co-founder, billionaire Paul Allen and Richard Branson, is a glossy and desperate pitch to put the eco-friendly in nuclear in light of Fukushima. Pandora's Promise, referring to the artifact, a box, or more accurately a jar, given to Pandora in Greek mythology by Zeus, which she out of curiosity opens and in turn releases all the evils in the world, promises that the fast breeder reactor technology cancelled in 1994 was always the answer we have been looking for, especially in times of fancied climate change. Thus, nuclear technology, which was traditionally misunderstood as evil, could represent the hope that Pandora found at the bottom of the jar or box, after inadvertently releasing the evil. Man-made climate change, born of carbon dioxide emissions, is the powerful gravitational drawcard, the beacon to which much of the green movement's political, financial, and emotional capital has been fastened. Pandora's Promise thus attempts to draw as much of the climate change movement away from anti-nuclear sentiments and inhibitions, and have them embrace this supposedly carbon-free, non-polluting nuclear technology. How the movie seeks to prize green support away from anti-nuclear is the PRISM, a fast breeder technology, the research of which is funded by Microsoft's Bill Gates, who is himself heavily invested in depleted uranium, and designed and constructed by GE Hitachi, whose reactor technology is currently melting down into the Pacific Ocean and into the Pacific jet stream. The fourth generation nuclear reactor, the fast breeder reactor, creates more plutonium waste than older designs, and if it were embraced today by first, second, and third world countries to meet their pressing energy needs, it would inevitably exacerbate nuclear weapons proliferation. Were it not used for more nuclear weapons, the plutonium waste has to be stored still after civilian use, and requires the same land space and resources for it to be stored as conventional plutonium. Notwithstanding these significant gaffes, the film Pandora's Promise makes an appeal that makes no sense. It makes the case for new nuclear technology that is better and safer than previous reactor designs, requiring billions more in research and development dollars from taxpayers that are, according to the film, already amazingly safe.
The breeder, I told you the finished reactor is costing $11 billion a gigawatt. This technology is 1.5 to 2 times as expensive as that. Okay, breeder technology is much more expensive. It's also less reliable. It also has, it's sodium cooled. Sodium is reactive, violently reactive, both to water and to air. We know what it does, and we know that when they built them, it was a waste of money. That the one that they built, the Super Phoenix, which is the most famous one that they built in France, gave 7% of the energy that it was expected to, and had to close after 15 years. The Manju plant that they built in Japan, which was the flagship of this kind of technology, had a fire in it and had to close down. The Kalkar plant, which was the flagship of the German breeder reactor effort, they never put plutonium in it, and it was used as an amusement park, and it is the only one of these plants to ever make money.
This is like the people who say that Cylindria went bankrupt and therefore we shouldn't build any more solar plants anymore. I mean, it's
all
just...
of them closed down, Robert. Every one of them closed down because they were unreliable and they were dangerous.
The IFR ran perfectly.
Hideously expensive.
The IFR ran
But let me
perfectly
tell you-
for 30 years.
Let me tell
perfectly.
let me tell you the real reason. Yeah, half of them operated okay, half of them
Okay,
had
well, that's pretty good for an experimental thing. So what's the problem with like moving forward?
Listen.
The film and its director Robert Stone uphold the World Health Organization line that no one died due to 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, and that a mere 56 people to date have died due to Chernobyl. Bee stings kill 58 Americans every year, and that is generally deemed to be acceptable. If we take the United Nations and the World Health Organization at their word, who are tied at the hip with the very pro-nuclear IAEA, then current nuclear plants by this measure have an absolutely outstanding safety record and must be embraced immediately. No need for fast breeders and documentaries about them. The movie thus has a plot that has no direction to go to and no compelling void to fill. The film farcically tries to create a nuclear industry year zero, creating an Orwellian memory hole into which the whole catalogue of dreadful cancer deaths and contamination, and deadliest of all, the litany of lies that have come out of the nuclear industry pertaining to its economic viability, its direct link to the weapons industry, the non-observance of even basic safety standards and lack of oversight of plant maintenance and nuclear plants to date, and the millions of deaths emanating from nuclear weapons and nuclear power fallout. All this is to be expunged from record, dumped into a repository and buried forever. The film runs on an alternative timeline from that of actual history and nuclear mortality rates. Of course, the deadly legacy of nuclear power must be obscured, otherwise the whole industry might be killed off. A hitherto unprecedented and much belated study published in the New York Academy of Sciences in 2010 that laid out the figure of 1 million Chernobyl deaths from the 1986 accident has been fiercely attacked by nuclear-sponsored academia. But if we go to the Pripyat region and actually investigate, we would find thousands of children and young adults with deformities and birth and heart defects, not to mention those who have died already.
You have to look at the worst case scenarios that have happened with even the most ridiculously designed reactor ever built, which is the one at Chernobyl. The worst case scenario turns out to be not the apocalypse that we all thought it was. I trust the United Nations and the World Health Organization that's done the definitive studies on this, and their conclusion is that Chernobyl has killed 56 people, which was probably the most astonishing fact I came across in making the whole film.
Of the 500,000 Chernobyl liquidators, the Russian military disclosed that 20,000 have died as of 2006, and 200,000 are permanently disabled. This is the price they paid, so that the whole of Europe remained habitable, and all of the Soviet Union's water supply from the Dnieper and the Black Sea remained drinkable. The reality is that Chernobyl has killed, and continues to kill many, many more than the World Health Organization presents. And if it were acknowledged to do so, it would undermine very powerful nuclear interests and corporations. The price was not solely paid by liquidators. Eastern European nations like Poland, Bulgaria, Estonia, Finland, and Russia itself have their own national cover-ups of their respective cancer and leukemia figures resulting from Chernobyl. The cases of illness and death are vastly underreported or obscured, especially after the Chernobyl dwarfing disaster at Fukushima. That is why the Reagan and any US help had to be turned away from Fukushima. That is why the Fukushima area and Greater Tokyo are not evacuated, despite the recommendation of the head of Japan's Atomic Energy Commission. And much of Japan is subject to nuclear waste incineration. That is why there is no alarm sounded as the radioactive plume, both seaborne and airborne, hits North America and moves on to circle the globe. The power of the nuclear weapons and nuclear power industry is that vast and dominating. Stone stated in a recent interview promoting his movie that his 1988 anti-nuclear documentary, Radio Bikini, was a little misconceived in that it lumped nuclear weapons and nuclear power into the same box. Stone posits that it was nuclear weapons that destroyed Bikini's environment and caused returned inhabitants to become sick and die. Nuclear power kills just as effectively as nuclear weapons, and to even draw a distinction between them is an exercise as ridiculous as it is dangerous. In 1951, a study by the US Atomic Energy Commission concluded that nuclear power generation was economically untenable as it did not generate enough profit to be viable. So fraught with risks are nuclear plants that a special act of Congress was made to exempt the nuclear industry from having to gain insurance for their operations to pay out potential victims and homeowners, the Price-Anderson Act. Wall Street firms wanted nothing to do with the insuring of the plants. The plant's construction and maintenance themselves are completely subsidized by the taxpayer. All this was overcome by the Atomic Energy Act in 1954, passed by Congress, that determined that nuclear power plants should be made economically feasible by having them sell the plutonium they generate to nuclear weapons manufacturers. Thus, it is no exaggeration for long-time anti-nuclear advocate Helen Caldicott to famously quip that every nuclear power plant is a bomb factory. The nuclear power industry is the nuclear weapons industry, which is GE, Westinghouse, Hitachi, Monsanto, all of whom are players in the military-industrial complex. As nuclear power and possibly new Generation 4 reactors and nuclear weapons become more sought after by countries like India, Pakistan, Israel, Iran, and North Korea, it creates a relentless positive feedback loop for plutonium generation, and thus nuclear weapons proliferation, as they are constantly jockeying for power and influence, and in turn more deterrence from their rivals and neighbors. The very public fear of weapons of mass destruction stoked vociferously after the US government attacked its own people on 9/11 and blamed a personal friend of the Bush family, who was already confirmed to be dead or on his deathbed, can now be used to legitimate US attacks and aggression on nation-states that the military-industrial complex finds uncooperative, as the reins of the US government and the military-industrial complex have been held by the international banking cartel.
Until 1990, they would not let U.S. troops use depleted uranium in any type of combat or even in any type of drills or firing range, proving ground testing, because it ignites going down the barrel, whether it's fired out of a Vulcan cannon in an A-10 Warthog, or whether it is fired out of a 50 caliber Barrett, or whether it's fired out of a 308 sniper rifle. It ignites going down the barrel, and then you breathe a large dose of the radioactive uranium that then at point blank range goes inside your cells and gives you cancer, destroys your kidneys, destroys your lungs, destroys your liver, destroys your skin, destroys your testicles, destroys your ovaries. This is what our troops are going through. U.S. military, last time I checked, has 5 times the birth defects now from the last 2 Gulf Wars. Fallujah has 16 times the world average for birth defects where DU was used.
If the US attacks its own people with nuclear weapons and blames Assyria or Iran, it will have the Pandora's premise to declare martial law and invoke its NDAA powers across the world. In light of Senator Lindsey Graham's paranoid warning that a nuclear weapon could go off in the United States if the United States did not bomb Syria, conservative radio talk show host Michael Savage has followed the story of several nuclear force command generals who have been fired by the Obama administration and the unprecedented secret removal of United States nuclear ordnance from Dyess Air Force Base for purposes unknown. If a nuclear weapon is exploited on American soil, the real perpetrators are much more likely to be persons working for or alongside the US government.
Is Obama purging the military of leaders, and why? Are there any updates?
What concerns me the most is all of these generals, not just generals, all these nuke commanders being fired and suspended, all by these higher-ups that are behind all of the nuclear weapons in the whole United States. And then they're appointing this guy that's been with the Pentagon since 2009, and it looks as if he is the guy that's going to do whatever they say. My speculation, based on what the source is telling me and based on this information, is that these new commanders have been fired and suspended because they would not play ball. They were not okay with an unsigned, off-the-record nuke transfer to South Carolina. And they were not okay with Lindsey Graham coming out and saying, hey, if we don't attack Syria, we could get nuked. And unfortunately, it seems like my source, they might have found who it is, and they threatened him or something like that because he's not speaking out anymore. So there are red flags going on. Well, I think the key thing here is that by just speaking about this, we might be stopping something. But as of right now, I think we're actually shielding this nation by just exposing this information.
In exchange for accepting losses of liberties, having heightened security checks, CCTV cameras and expanded police powers, the public have accepted a new form of security, which may not be very secure at all. The coalition of the willing now wages terrible and costly wars, seeking out weapons of mass destruction, even when there are none to be found. But the war on terrorism is of course illusory and now horribly misdirected. Fukushima is the weapon of mass destruction par excellence. Those mystery 1,300 spent fuel rods, whether burned already, partially or not at all, are merely a mirror to the 91% of leaking reactors across the world, and the thousands upon thousands of water-cooled spent fuel rods perilously stacked together and staggered all over the world, near the very reactors that they were expended in, and often placed near huge population centers, in reactor buildings and facilities that rely largely on 1960s and 70s technology. Workers tending the Fukushima plant itself are poorly paid, hastily and questionably assembled, and lacking in training and morale and equipment. Any mistake or act of God could easily trigger a chain reaction that would release the whole of the plant's nuclear inventory, its reactor cores, its larger and adjacent fuel pools, and vast radioactive water storages. A succinct explanation of why the US or coalitions of the willing will not intervene and assist so that the Battle of Fukushima can begin can perhaps be found not at Fukushima, but deep within the bulkheads of the evacuated USS Ronald Reagan. Deep inside its hull are two Westinghouse A4W nuclear reactors. The Reagan, like every other branch of the US military of course, is nuclear armed. The US military wields nuclear hardwares such as depleted uranium ammunition, nuclear-tipped tomahawks and giant ICBMs. Every one of these nuclear missiles is owned and controlled not by the military, but by the Department of Energy. It is the kingpin of the military-industrial complex, replete with revolving door connections to corporations like Bechtel, Monsanto, GE, Toshiba, and of course Westinghouse. For the US military to begin the Battle of Fukushima, if any victory or redemption can be won at all at this stage, would be a direct attack not merely on the prestige and profit, but the very existence of nuclear power. It would be attacking the very hand that feeds it, that enriches its own on-ship nuclear weapons arsenal, and provides the ship itself propulsion through the two on-board nuclear reactors.
I met with the Navy when I was in San Diego. They searched me, wouldn't let me videotape anything, and we talked about the fight that went on in the Situation Room with the military and the Department of Energy. Now, we know, I reported it, and it came out that Briner from Cal Berkeley, and now it's public domain, that there was a 32-panel team put together in the Situation Room, put together by the president, and he is running that show. I'm heavily involved with the Marine culture. I know for a fact that the Navy and the Marine is going to war over Fukushima. They're fighting tooth and nail with the Department of Energy, and the Department of Energy won out in the early days. You know, on the USS Reagan, they were all sent in. And it goes even much further than that. You know, and Jacko's confirmed it himself. You listen to Gregory Jacko, and he, you know, when you listen to him, people have to be careful too and realize that he cannot cross the line. He was in the Situation Room. He'll be worse off than Snowden if he crossed the line. The Department of Energy is a cabal of evil from hell, and they have power even over the Navy and the Marines. And this is coming from the Navy down there, the personnel and the Marines that I have. They want it in. They wanted in. They had the people in the early days, and it was the Department of Energy, which is, by the way, you know, it's the Department of Nuclear, has pushed them to the side, and that's who's running the show. I don't know what kind of roll of the dice the nuclear industry is playing. I mean, that this is just somehow going to go away, and we're going to keep building plants. I mean, we got one ready to go online in Georgia. I think that is the arrogance of the Department of Energy. And I think
who they work for, Kevin? They work for the throne of England.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, she has most of the uranium. She owns most of the uranium deposits in the world.
Oh, and it's true. It's absolutely true. You know, we fought against the freaking Queen in 1774, and that's what this is. We gave it all back. We got rid of tariffs, we got rid of usury laws, and they are all in uranium. I mean, that's their bit. It's not even the nuclear industry, it's the uranium. You know, the depleted uranium in every single weapon there is. And you know, what did I read? Her net worth has gone up. I'm an ex-hedge fund guy. Her net worth over the last 20 years has went up 18,000% because of
trillions and trillions of dollars. And you know, but that's just the beginning of what they control.
If the nuclear aspect of the Fukushima disaster can remain hidden, the nuclear industry and the military-industrial complex can survive and thrive and carry on the war on the people of the world. Even if a nuclear reactor were ever developed that was safe and economically viable and did not even create nuclear bombs somehow, it would still be irrelevant in light of the unprecedented disaster at Fukushima, born of nuclear technologies that preceded it. Pandora's Promise was never a fast breeder reactor. It was a series of promises made in 1945, promises reneged upon that are killing the biosphere as we speak. After Hiroshima's bomb on August 6, 1945, the US Secretary of War, who oversaw the bomb's creation and secured all the necessary funding from Congress, assured the public in a statement, "Atomic fission holds great promise for sweeping developments, by which our civilization may be enriched when peace comes. It will be a matter of further research and development to design machines for the conversion of atomic energy into useful power. Mindful of the grave problems that arise concerning the control of the weapon and the implications of this science for the peace of the world, every effort is being bent towards assuring that this weapon and the new field of science that stands behind it will be employed wisely in the interest of the security of peace-loving nations and the well-being of the world." A promise made, and subsequently made a complete mockery of. Whether or not Henry Stimson's promise was genuine is irrelevant, as what has transpired since are thousands of above-ground nuclear tests, the proliferation of toxic and leaking nuclear power plants, and nuclear weapons, horrific yet officially downplayed nuclear accidents, widespread dumping of toxic nuclear waste, culminating in the cancer epidemic we witness today in the old and the young, the rise of socially and environmentally regressive and unregulated corporations like GE, Bechtel, and Monsanto, all key members of the ever war-waging military-industrial complex, and now the permanent and ongoing poisoning of the Pacific Ocean and its jet stream. Notably, Monsanto, the key player in the enrichment of uranium in the wartime Manhattan Project, has been the foster parent of deadly poisoning and mutation of the food supply, both through the radiation released from atomic fission it helped to create, and now complemented by its genetic modification of crops and seeds, made more and more universal by its infiltration into the US Food and Drug Administration and equivalent government bodies across the world. Bill Gates, who proselytizes about saving the third world, and the world in general from global warming, is a major Monsanto investor, a promoter of nuclear power, and financier of climate engineering and weather modification. We think of World War III as an unrestricted nuclear ballistic missile confrontation between nations. But in fact, World War III may have begun decades ago through other means, but no less deadly.
And then, of course, and this is the big one, with the atmospheric nuclear testing, 1952 to 1980. Because what I conclude in all of this, and I think I've said it before, is that actually, even if everything went up from Fukushima, it would still not be as much as the injection into the world environment, the global environment, from the combined atmospheric nuclear tests between 1952 and 1980. It comes to about 60% of them. So if we take all of the radionuclides that came out in the atom bombs and the explosions that occurred in the Marshall Islands, the United States Marshall Islands tests, and then, of course, the British tests at Christmas Island and the French tests at Mururoa and in North Africa, and then, of course, the enormously big Russian tests in Kazakhstan, the Tsar bomber, which was 40 megatons. These tests blew an enormous amount of radioactivity up into the stratosphere, where it came pitter-patter down after about 1959 through to 1964, and the strontium-90 built up in everybody's bones, and the iodine went everywhere, and the tritium increased, and carbon-14 increased, and Sakharov and Pauling both said that this would cause enormous increases in cancer, which of course it has done. And so compared to that, if the whole of Fukushima goes up, it will only be about the same as that. But actually, it'll be a lot less than that. And the reason is that the atmospheric test blew all this stuff into the global environment with their enormous power.
But what we have now is something that is almost universal and global, and the situation, because of the sheer magnitude of the problem, the level of radionuclide emissions into the environment from all sorts of sources, from the depleted uranium, from the new super weapons that use uranium, from the endless leaking of these nuclear power stations, which have just continued and are getting worse because as the nuclear power stations themselves are getting old. All of these things have conspired together to increase the concentration of radionuclides in the environment to a level where it is now threatening life on Earth. There's no question that it is reducing fertility, that it is increasing cancer, and the future looks really quite bleak. And particularly it looks bleak because of what I can now go on to. You asked me to look at this Fukushima situation.
But what you say so eloquently is what Eisenhower in his farewell address warned about. He said the military-industrial complex has been seized by corporate interest, and it itself is then seizing the entire scientific complex to where they will be unopposable. And now they've hired all these mercenary scientists that will go along with anything. And it does seem like the madness of Nero or something.
It's not. It's even worse, because not only do they acquire scientists by paying them money in order to provide bogus scientific reports that support their position, but anyone who happens to stand up and say something which they don't like, or find something which goes against their crazy worldview, this person gets swiftly dealt with. I mean, I can name names. There was a young scientist in Sweden called Martin Tondell who discovered that there was a significant increase in cancer in the northern Sweden after the very small amounts of radioactivity conventionally expressed that fell in northern Sweden after the Chernobyl accident. Now, he was swiftly dealt with by his boss. His boss is a chap called Lars Erik Holm, who was the ex-head of the International Commission on Radiological Protection, and is now, would you believe, can you imagine, the medical officer of health for Sweden.
Wow.
So if you want to know what's happening in Sweden in terms of health, you go to Lars Erik Holm. And we can find many situations in which this sort of thing happens.
Monsanto.
It's a sort of third world war, isn't it? It's the governments versus the people.
The ultimate comeuppance of this promise, from the opening of Pandora's box in 1945, is the runaway radioactive contamination and poisoning of the biosphere. It stems from a deep-seated poisoning of the institutions and even NGOs that we would have thought should have protected us or warned us of the dangers. These bodies have supped at the table of the nuclear industry, or let it, or pure rent-seeking, silence them. All these fail-safes and supposed guardians of the public interest have failed in colossal terms at Fukushima. If nuclear proliferation, or a nuclear false flag, 9/11 style attack, results in even a limited nuclear war, we will get on top of inexorable decay of ecosystems and our own DNA, a massive irreversible climate change, not from carbon dioxide that plants breathe, but from the resultant nuclear winter for hundreds of years, ending all life on Earth, except perhaps burrowing insects, or some organisms living off deep-sea volcanic vents. The dark truth of what was promised was more honestly spoken of by Einstein, who declared that the splitting of the atom would lead to unparalleled catastrophe, and Robert Oppenheimer.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
The macabre promise foreseen by Oppenheimer and Einstein is becoming fulfilled with frightening aplomb. It is indeed completely befitting of the mythology of Pandora's box used by Robert Stone, as indeed all the evils are being released into the world. And in the end, two of the three key figures in the bomb's creation, Einstein, Oppenheimer, like Pandora herself, were deeply saddened and guilt-ridden for opening the box. Yet Stimson died believing the bomb, and his legacy could usher in still a new era of peace.
Is there any form of safe atomic or nuclear power?
No, there isn't. It's not possible to constrain the atom. It's not possible to do anything with the atom that is safe enough, that prevents releases of these radionuclides. And all of these radionuclides have significant harmful effects at very, very low concentrations. So the answer is no, you can't do that. But the people in the United States have their own problems, and the dangers there are much greater from the local nuclear
I was about
sites.
to say, now whenever they have a leak or a problem, they don't even tell you.
No, that's right. And so if you're worried about radioactivity in fish, you want to worry about the fish that swim in the river, which is fed water by the nuclear reactor near you, because a map that I've seen of the United States with nuclear reactors is like somebody's thrown a lot of darts at it. There are an awful lot of nuclear reactors, and they're all very old, and they're all falling to pieces, and they're all leaking like sieves, and it's all going into the ground, and it's all going into your food and your water.
Sure,
and
what about
air.
the number that I see of 91%? CBS News says 75% of reactors are leaking. Well, what's the real number from your research?
Well, I would think 100% is the number that are leaking. It's absolutely not possible to function with a nuclear power station without it leaking. It can't be done.
Just exactly how much spent fuel we have here in the United States at the 100-plus nuclear reactors around the country?
Well, we have the largest inventory of spent fuel in the world. It's about, it's been recently reported to be, at this time, about 71,000 metric tons. And it really represents the largest concentration of radioactivity on the planet. And what we found is that these pools are vulnerable, and that the United States, for the last several decades, has permitted the reactor operators to put as much as 4 times more in the spent fuel pools than their designs envisioned.
4 times?
That's right.
So just relative to what's happening in Fukushima, do we have 4 times the quantity of what is now being stored at the reactors in Fukushima?
Oh, easily, and then more.
No, but I mean at each reactor.
That's right. That's right. I mean, the Fukushima reactor basically on the average contain about 100 metric tons. Spent fuel pools in the United States contain as much as 500, 600, 700 metric tons.
Okay, so let's turn to the response from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to your report. What was it?
What we reported, which I think is important, is that these pools were vulnerable and that if they were something caused them to drain, they would lose their water. The temperature in the spent fuel, because of the radioactive material decaying, would get so high that it would cause essentially the cladding of the fuel to catch fire and release catastrophic amounts of radioactivity. And we estimated that a single pool fire in the United States at a typical reactor could render an area uninhabitable substantially greater than that created by the Chernobyl accident. The Chernobyl accident created an area of inhabitability that's roughly the size of half of New Jersey.
So you're suggesting that this would be even greater than that, greater than half of New Jersey, and how much greater?
4 to 5 times. The response by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the nuclear industry was hostile.
Why do you think the NRC was so hostile to this report and its findings?
I think that the NRC has become entirely too codependent on the nuclear industry which it regulates.
The situation in which we find ourselves cannot be forged into some warm, fuzzy afterglow moment about harnessing new technologies that have in truth just been rebranded as new and improved and green, because that would be a lie. The only positive to gain is that upon enough of us fully grasping the truly dreadful nature of what is happening in the Pacific, we can take positive steps to urgently inform others of what we know and unseat our leaders and institutions who have betrayed our trust and are destroying this world and promise peace, but instead administer deadly radioactive poison.
I see a lot of people putting effort into getting, petitions and, calling their congressmen and all this, and I think it's a waste of time. Yeah. They're not going to do anything. They are not going to go against these corporations till, everything in the Pacific is dead. I mean, that's how bad it's going to have to get before anybody acknowledges it, and they'll probably still lie to us. So, I mean, it's up to us and social media to use every avenue that we have to reach.
That's people. It. Our only chance, and I've known this from even before it happened, was our only chance is popular opinion. That is our only chance.
It is we who can make a promise to the present, to the future, and to the memory, the suffering and toil of those who came before us, to let the truth be known, for the truth may just be enough to set us nuclear free. The betrayal at Fukushima and at nuclear plants must be ended. A credible international task force must be sent to Fukushima now. World War III must be stopped, and the very possible and so easily induced foray into thermonuclear war, World War IV, must be avoided at all costs. By avoiding and not fighting the Battle of Fukushima, our government and corporate masters have left it up to us to take responsibility, to push and clamour for this dreadful disaster to be fixed or mitigated, for much of northern Japan to be evacuated, for the deliberate spread of radiation through incineration and obscured contamination of the food supply to end, for health advisories and radiation reports to be given freely, and the evacuation of affected parts of North America to be made where necessary. Those who do not represent us faithfully must be replaced, or we will be replaced, or more bluntly, annihilated. The war on terrorism should be a war on real terrorists, and they are to be found within, defined by their warmongering and domestic internal terrorism, and simultaneous silence on what is really killing us and the planet. The flagship organizations of the Green Movement have been blatantly fighting the wrong war in obsessing about carbon dioxide that is perfectly non-toxic and beneficial to plants and animals that live off them. At Fukushima, they have grossly failed to uphold even their own vaunted precautionary principles. If our generation will not be the one to right nuclear wrongs in battle, then the Battle of Fukushima will have to be fought and lost by the valiant but outmatched DNA and immune systems of the children we are biologically and morally tasked to protect first, and defenseless organisms, since the radiation will by then have become too great if we delay. The Battle of Fukushima must be begun and won before. If war is indeed an omen for death, we can only hope that in our struggle to avoid annihilation, it can be forged into an omen of death, not to ourselves, but to all things nuclear, so that all other things may live.
So we back in the club, get that bodies rocking from side to side, side to side. Thank God the week is done. I feel like a zombie come back to life, back to life. Hands up, and suddenly we all got our hands up. No control of my body. Ain't I seen you before? I think I remember those eyes, 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 eyes. Baby, tonight the tea just got us falling in love again. Yeah, baby, tonight the tea just got us falling in love again. So dance, dance like it's the last night of your life. I'ma get you right. 'Cause baby, tonight the tea just got us falling in love again. Keep downing drinks like this. No tomorrow, not just right now, 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 now. Gonna set the roof on fire. Gonna burn this mother down, 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 down. Hands up. When the music drops, we both put our hands up. Put your hands on my body. Swear I've seen you before. I think I remember those eyes, 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 eyes. Baby, tonight the tea just got us falling in love again. Yes, baby, tonight the tea just got us falling in love again. So dance, dance like it's the last night of your life. I'ma get you right. 'Cause baby, tonight the tea just got us falling in love again. light up your life, I'ma get you right. 'Cause baby, tonight, the DJ's gun is falling in love again. I just gotta.